What is the biggest bullet you've ever dodged without realizing it at the time? Story 1. A guy I was dating for almost 5 years went momentarily psycho on me, just for an instant. I said absolutely not, flew back home mid-vacation and changed my locks. It turned out he was living a double life, and this was his pattern. When he got serious with someone new, he'd turn violent toward the person he was dating so they'd run away quickly. No messy breakups or attempts at reconciliation. His exes would then go out of their way to avoid him out of fear he'd go nuts on them. Because the world is weird, I'm now friends with 2 of his other exes, and we've compared notes. He lives a completely scripted life. The same love letters, the same birthday gifts. All 3 of us even have the exact same custom-made t-shirt. I really dodged a bullet leaving him. Story 2. I don't know about the biggest, but a bullet I definitely remember dodging was when a bunch of my friends in college joined one of those sales companies that are really just multi-level marketing schemes disguised as something else. It was a soft drink company called something like Vema. My friends were super excited about joining to make side money as broke college students, and they convinced me to come to one of their presentations since I was broke too. The presentation was incredibly weird. Almost the entire time they were trying to convince us they were not a pyramid scheme but instead worked as a reverse funnel system. I found it strange that so much of the presentation was spent insisting on what they were not. I noped out after that, even though several of my friends tried to pressure me into joining. I later realized they were just trying to make money off of me signing up. They all ended up losing thousands of dollars, since that was roughly the cost of the initial investment. Story 3. I dated this girl when I was 18, and she was obsessed with getting pregnant. Allegedly, her doctor had told her that she had cysts on her ovaries and that she might never bear children, which made her desire them even more. She would make excuses about using protection, claiming that she was allergic to latex. When I bought latex-free ones, she was allegedly allergic to those as well. She was on the pill, but she would often forget to take it, which meant her medication was ineffective. One time, when I was dropping her off at home, we pulled up beside her house, and she said to me, "I have something to tell you. I am pregnant." I had done everything in my power to prevent the situation as we were so young. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and stared into the distance, thinking about how I could become a father and how frustrated I was, realizing how obvious it was that she had been trying to frigging manipulate the situation the entire time. Then she added, "By the way, I am not pregnant. I just wanted to see how you would react if I said that." Broke up right there and then. There was a guy in my friend group who strongly disliked me, and he saw an opportunity to get back at me by pursuing my ex-girlfriend. A couple of months later, surprise, she became pregnant, and he was the father. It turned out she hated being pregnant. My best friend's younger sister, who was older than my ex, was pregnant around the same time, but much further along. She had a premature birth and shared updates about complications on social media. My ex responded to one of these posts saying that my friend's sister was lucky to have her child prematurely because it meant she no longer had to endure the pregnancy. Her comment was shocking in its insensitivity though. Looking back, it was typical of how she would speak before thinking. When she finally gave birth, the father disappeared because he preferred to smoke rather than care for his child, leaving her as a single mother. 15 years later, a friend of a friend entered a relationship with her, and they had a little girl. He added me on PlayStation a few years back, and we started playing games together. He told me that they had split up because she was extremely difficult, often preventing him from seeing his daughter and showing little interest in parenting. He described how she preferred to stay inside playing video games rather than spending time with her children, which caused ongoing frustration. I can safely say this is the biggest bullet I have ever dodged. My life would be so miserable if she had been the mother of my child. Story 4. I got turned down from a job I really wanted because I asked whether there was any room for higher pay. I felt crushed. A couple of months later, I was working at a different place for more money, with a shorter commute and better future prospects. Then, a disgruntled older employee at the first place took his coworkers hostage and killed the guy who ended up taking the position I was supposed to have. I dodged a literal bullet. Story 5. I was good friends with this girl in college. We were always in separate relationships, so nothing ever happened between us. When we both ended up single, we went out one night, partied a bit, ended up back at a hotel, and things were clearly heading towards something more. Right before it happened, something in me said, "No, I need a protection," and I didn't move forward. I paused, stepped back, and we just messed around a bit instead, but didn't go all the way. It turned out she had an STD the entire time. She was fully prepared to sleep with me without a protection and never said a word. I found out later and was furious, not because she had it, but because she wasn't going to tell me and was completely fine putting me at risk. Story 6. Not my bullet, but a former friend of mine. I was taking her back to her apartment after a night out dancing. As we pulled up, she commented that one of the cars looked like the guy she had recently stopped dating. I offered to walk her up. She declined, but I insisted. Something just felt off. We went up to her apartment and went inside. Everything looked normal, but I walked through, turning on all the lights. I found nothing and was about to leave. Then I had the sudden thought to check the balcony. There he was, barely visible, crouched in the corner. He had somehow scaled his way up to her third-story balcony. All these years later, it still scares me to think about what his intentions were. Story 7. I was nearly kidnapped as a child, and the memory has stayed with me ever since. At the time, I was recovering from a fairly serious injury, and walking to school was difficult, but I couldn't afford to miss another day. That particular morning, I was in more pain than usual, limping along the sidewalk, when a stranger pulled up beside me in a car and offered me a ride. Like an absolute idiot, I agreed, desperate to avoid the pain of walking. Once inside the vehicle, things quickly turned frightening. The man stated getting touchy. I froze in shock, unsure what to do. Fortunately, he had made a critical error. The windows were down, and the doors weren't locked. At that precise moment, a local woman who knew me from the neighborhood happened to see me. She called my name loudly, and in that instant, I realized I had a chance to escape. I told the man, "Sorry, I gotta go," and bolted from the car. He sped off, leaving me shaken but free. The woman stayed with me, walking me to school, where I recounted the incident to the school guidance counselor, who immediately contacted my mother. News of the incident spread quickly in my small neighborhood, and everyone became aware that a stranger in a car had approached a child with malicious intent. The situation escalated over the next few days. The man drove around my neighborhood repeatedly, and on one occasion, I saw him while standing outside my house. Our eyes met, and I realized that he now knew exactly where I lived. I told my mother about it, and a few older neighborhood youths, early 20s, known for not being strangers to violence, overheard our conversation. I didn't understand the implications at the time, but I knew they were watching. A few days later, I overheard one of these young men speaking to my mother. He said, calmly but firmly, "Your daughter won't be seeing that car anymore." Later that afternoon, I saw the man again, and there was fresh blood on his pants. I didn't grasp it fully as a child, but over time, I realized what had likely occurred. Those older neighborhood kids had confronted the predator and ensured he could no longer threaten anyone in our community. If the woman hadn't seen me, if the man's doors had been locked, or if the neighborhood youths hadn't intervened, the story could have ended very differently. Story 8. I worked as a graduate student in a chemistry lab that dealt with some unstable chemicals, if mishandled. We had a graduate student who was fairly lax with their handling of these chemicals, but the fact that they were not kicked out is a story for another time. We were both working late in the lab, and I left early for a social event the school was hosting while they stayed behind. The protocol required 2 people to be in the lab at all times for safety, in case something went wrong and emergency services needed to be called. I told them I was leaving, and they said they would be right behind me. 2 hours later, the most experienced chemist on campus came in for their night shift. The other student had apparently put about 3 kilograms of chemicals to dry over a flame and left, assuming they would simply dry out. Instead, what they were working with turned into a contact explosive. If I or the other graduate student had tried to handle it, we likely would have blown up the entire lab, but the chemist was able to defuse the situation. Story 9. A few years ago, my now ex-wife divorced me because, in her words, she didn't like me anymore. Within 2 years, she had run up over $100,000 in credit card debt through online gambling, lost her house, which had been our house, developed a drug habit, and lost her job. As far as I know, she is still unemployed and struggling to make ends meet, though I hope she has figured herself out. We are long past schadenfreude. At first, I felt vindicated because she was constantly worried that I would develop a drug habit and hounded me for not making enough money to support her and her kids. Realizing that those fears were entirely projection was validating. Now, though, that feeling has given way to pity. Story 10. I was at a small music festival where they were selling helicopter rides. I stood in line with a buddy. The helicopter could take 4 people, and there were 3 people in front of us. Because I wanted to ride with my friend, I told the guy behind us that he could go ahead. The helicopter crashed. Everyone on board died except him and he later died in the hospital. It could have been me. Story 11. This happened decades ago, but the roof over the ice rink at Colonnade Mall collapsed and injured a number of people. I avoided it by about a minute. After parking my car and starting to walk toward the ice rink, I realized I had forgotten to move my bag to the boot. I walked back to do that, then headed toward the rink again. Just as I reached the entrance of the mall, the roof came down. If I hadn't gone back to my car, I would have been injured in the collapse. Story 12. I was moving to the other side of the country, and the drive took over a week. I had lived in an apartment in a dodgy area, and the building had a Facebook page for residents. Basically an online message board for important notices, like if a homeless person was sleeping in the elevator again, or if cars in the parking lot were being broken into. On day 2 of my drive, I saw a notification from that page. Pictures of the entire apartment building engulfed in flames. Great timing on the move out. Apparently residents weren't allowed back for months while a remediation company went through the building. When people were finally allowed to retrieve their belongings, many found valuables had gone missing. Story 13. I am going to reframe this question to focus on the metaphorical bullet I took. It was an unexpected moment that disrupted my life and forced a difficult pause. That experience ultimately became the catalyst for meaningful growth and lasting positive change, even though it felt anything but beneficial at the time. When I was in 8th grade, year 9, I was, for all intents and purposes, the overweight, awkward, and often unkempt kid. I was depressed, did not really take care of myself, and carried a deeply negative view of everyone and everything around me because of my family situation and home life. I lived in a rural town, so there was very little interaction with people outside of school, which made isolation feel normal and constant. Around Christmas, I wanted a bike so that I could become a bit healthier and feel some control over my own body. My school was only about 4 miles, 6.3 kilometers from my house, so I thought that was some easy exercise and a manageable challenge. I got the bike, and my mother was concerned that the distance would be too much for me to start with right away. Over the break, I took it upon myself to ride to school and back on multiple days to prove that I could handle it and stay committed. She eventually agreed, and on a Friday, she dropped me and my bike off at school so that I could ride it home, with the understanding that if all went well, I could start biking to school regularly. All did not go well. The school sat on top of a small hill, and I made it less than halfway down before something happened. I still have no idea what exactly caused it, and the bike slid out from under me. I put my arm out instinctively, wrist angled down, and hit the pavement in that position, shattering both bones in my forearm and forcing my 2 front teeth into my bottom lip, breaking one at the root and snapping the other in half. I had surgery to remove asphalt from my arm and later had the half tooth reconstructed so that it would not remain an exposed nerve. Before that repair, I once bit into a pizza crust, and the pain felt like lightning shooting directly into my brain. Sharp, immediate, and unforgettable. How taking this bullet led to a life-changing event for the better was not immediately apparent, as everything about the experience felt miserable, disorienting, and overwhelming, and the future ahead appeared uncertain and undefined. Because I was already depressed before this occurred, I was not the most dedicated student, and this moment ultimately became a necessary interruption that allowed my life to slow down, reassess priorities, and move on to a more constructive path. After the accident, I was on pain, medication, and very much less focused than before. I developed insomnia and ended up sleeping in class most days, which only made things worse. Because of all of this, I was facing being transferred into high school through the so-called Remedial 8.5 program, something I deeply dreaded and feared. I did not look forward to being in high school with people who had already seen me at my worst, especially since some of them were openly antagonistic toward me. I talked to the counselor and requested that I be held back to repeat 8th grade. After several discussions between the counselor and my mother, they agreed that it might be the better option for my long-term growth. I used the summer to work on my outlook on life and slowly rebuild my sense of self and confidence. I attempted to change my wardrobe to be more stylish instead of just black or gray cotton shorts, sweatpants, and t-shirts. I brushed my hair, showered daily, and started making the positive changes I truly needed to feel human again. In the second year of 8th grade, having already listened to most of the lessons before, I excelled in the coursework and was transferred into honors classes for many subjects. I made new friends, experienced genuine connection, and for the first time in a long while, I felt happy, capable, and hopeful. Between that year and the next, I ate better and lost weight healthily and steadily. I grew taller, became more confident, and started to feel comfortable in my own skin, something I had never really experienced before in my life. Around October or November of that year, in Algebra Honors, I was introduced to a friend I had made during that second year. She liked some of the same music I did and introduced me to new artists and sounds. She flirted with me, and eventually we started dating, something I never believed would happen for me back then. All of this happened well over 25 years ago. We have been together for 24 years, as of October 2025, married for 19, and we have a teenage son. We have successful careers, a stable home, and a life built on patience, growth, and shared effort. I am happy, content, and proud of what we have accomplished together. I would have been unlikely to meet my wife had I been placed in that remedial program even though it was in the same school. I would have likely continued down a path of sadness, remaining deeply unhappy and stuck in patterns I did not yet know how to escape. So what bullet did I dodge? I dodged the bullet of mediocrity and quiet unhappiness, and instead redirected my own path by taking an earth-shaped bullet straight to the face, one that forced me to stop, reflect, and change direction entirely. I could not be happier with where that unexpected impact ultimately led me. Story 14. In July 2000, the CEO of Kmart fired the entire board of directors and brought in retired Walmart executives to save the company from a fourth bankruptcy. That board immediately decided Kmart would adopt Walmart's rollback idea, but rebranded it as the Blue Light Initiative, because Kmart is likely best remembered for the Blue Light Special. Step 1 involved installing a $15,000 Bose brand surround sound stadium speaker system in the center of every Kmart store, with a circular blue awning and a rotating searchlight that cast a blue hue throughout the store. Most Kmart employees found it unusual at first, but they eventually got used to it. Then, in July 2001, on a Wednesday afternoon, every store manager called an all-employee meeting. They explained that the Kmart Board of Directors was launching the 300,000-item rollback initiative. Every store in the United States was required to remove, replace, and attach a wobbler for every shelf tag in the store. The wobbler was an adhesive cardboard flag on which we had to write the was price, the now price, and the savings price on both sides. The store manager made it clear that all activities other than shelf label replacement and wobbler attachment were to stop. No stocking, no cashiers, no cart collection, no customer service, only swapping labels. She explained that the mandate was to have all 300,000 labels swapped by 12 noon on Friday, or she would be terminated immediately without severance. The assistant manager would then be promoted without an increase in pay, and every department lead would be promoted to assistant manager, again without an increase in pay. I was offered a $1 raise to become a salaried assistant manager 2 weeks before this meeting. I dodged the bullet. Salaried employees in retail are paid a flat rate for 40 to 45 hours per week. Salaried managers are mandated to work a minimum of 60 to 90 hours per week. That $1 raise would have effectively been a $2 pay cut per actual hour worked. I volunteered to work overnight on Wednesday and Thursday to focus exclusively on labels and wobblers. My paycheck was still hourly, not salaried. So when I saw the 175% total pay due to overtime deposited directly into my bank, I smiled. On August 28, 2001, the board realized they had made a mistake. Walmart owned the rollback signature price ending in 8 instead of 9. As a result, they sent the same mandate to the newly promoted store managers. Replace all 300,000 of those new labels and wobblers because every price was being reduced by 1 penny. I completed that overnight again. September 9th, 2001, we received a preview of the new Blue Light Special Rollback weekly ad flyer. It featured on the front a Playskool brand toy jet flying above the Playskool car wash, which was a flat building with 2 tall towers, with the jet flying between them. The title above it read, New Explosive Savings. That ad appeared in the September 10th, 2001 editions of the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and other publications. Then, on September 11th, the tragic events of 9/11 occurred. The imagery suddenly felt both prophetic and devastating. I quit Kmart because I saw that the company was on a doomed path. However, my store manager was never fired, largely because I had worked those 2 overnight shifts non-stop, swapping labels and pasting wobblers throughout the store. Story 15. When I was a junior in high school, over 10 years ago now, I had a guy friend named Tom, who was a grade above me and shared one of the same classes. He was already friends with my older brother before we met, so he eventually started talking to me, and we became friends as well. He would often ask to hang out after school so we could study together. It turned out he mostly wanted to hang out and talk rather than actually study, which I found a little odd at the time. One day, my brother mentioned that he thought Tom might have a bit of a crush on me. I was really surprised since I had no experience with boys or dating at all, but I realized I had also developed a fairly big crush on Tom. I started noticing Tom flirting with me more and more, but I wasn't completely sure what was going on. So one day I asked him over text, "Are we just friends?" or something to that effect. Tom then admitted that he really liked me and was attracted to me, but explained that we shouldn't date because he was leaving for college the following year. I told him I completely understood and that there were no hard feelings. I was a little sad, but it seemed like a valid reason to avoid starting a relationship, so we tried to continue being friends as usual. A couple of weeks later, I noticed Tom was acting very hot and cold. Like one moment we were best friends, and the next he didn't want to talk at all. I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he had started dating another girl in my grade. Mind you, this was a girl I knew, someone I had been somewhat friendly with, who would also be living in the same town while Tom went to college. I was completely blindsided and heartbroken. Tom and I didn't really talk much after that, and I had to watch his relationship with this girl unfold on social media. I felt hurt and foolish for a long time, but eventually I moved on with my life. About 6 years ago, I ran into that girl in my hometown and we talked for a while. She was very kind and told me that she and Tom had broken up some time ago, and that while they were together, he had pressured her into using heroin with him. She ended up developing an addiction because of his influence. To say I dodged a bullet is an understatement. It's entirely possible that Tom rejected me because he knew he wouldn't be able to influence me into doing drugs with him. I'll probably never know for sure, but in hindsight, I can confidently say, bullet dodged. Story 16, not getting in. The car to go find him was the bullet I dodged. We were fighting because he wanted me to take his already insanely drunk ass to the store to buy more booze. He decided to leave on foot, but not before throwing his phone at me so the cops couldn't find him when he did something stupid. I let him go. For a moment, I thought he would just walk to the liquor store, steal a bottle, and pass out on the street somewhere. My gut told me otherwise. About 30 minutes later, I heard multiple cop cars speeding down the road, heading in the direction I feared most. I waited, then got on Facebook and checked one of the local gossip pages. My fear was confirmed. He went to his workplace, where he had just been fired, and attacked an ex-coworker with a machete. He was sentenced to 15 to 25 years. His extensive violent record did him no favors at sentencing. The reason I say I dodged a bullet is because I would not have made it out of 2020 if I had gone to get him. He would have killed me by the end of that year, possibly even before my dad's death that December. He had me so messed up on so many things that I likely wouldn't have lasted much longer on my own anyway. Now, I'm clean from everything except weed. I learned how to finally be solely responsible for myself and not rely on anyone. That was huge for me. He left me with a severe amount of trauma and deep regrets that I'll never be able to fix or fully get over, but I guess the moral of this story, the bullet I dodged, was death. Story 17, 25. Plus years ago, when I was in college, we were hosting a fairly large homecoming party at the fraternity house I belonged to. Each year, these parties drew our members, random students from around the area, alumni, and anyone else who happened to stumble upon the event. Our house had a reputation around campus as the party house, which meant it was usually crowded and chaotic, with people arriving unexpectedly, making security and monitoring a real challenge. Well, this time, I was assigned to work the door, which meant checking IDs, collecting cover charges, and making sure everyone entering was accounted for properly. There had been a girl who had been flirting with me for a few weeks, and we were at that awkward stage where I couldn't tell if she really liked me or was just being playful. While I was working, she approached and started talking with me, noticeably intoxicated, and I had to remain vigilant because my responsibilities included supervising the entry along with another friend. As she spoke, I noticed an older man whom none of us recognized, already inside the party. I was certain he had not passed through my checkpoint because I hadn't marked his hand to indicate payment, so he must have snuck in through another entrance or been let in by someone else. The man appeared to be in his 40s, noticeably older than most partygoers. I watched as he moved closer to the girl I was speaking with, and I immediately became alert to the situation, realizing he might be attempting something inappropriate. Suddenly, he stumbled, and I saw an object briefly floating in her cup before sinking to the bottom. I quickly grabbed the cup out of her hand and took it outside, preventing her from ingesting whatever had been placed there. She became upset initially, but after I explained that a-hole had slipped something into her drink, she understood and appreciated my intervention. I then signaled a few friends to remove the man from the party, and they were firm in doing so. I can still visualize him bouncing down the concrete steps outside, clearly disoriented and removed from the environment. After everything had settled, I decided to tag out at the door and check in on the girl to make sure she was safe and okay, while giving someone else a turn monitoring the entry. She was fine and extremely grateful for what I had done, even offering to accompany me up to my room afterward. I declined, recognizing that she was intoxicated, and it wouldn't have been responsible or appropriate to accept, despite my interest in her. This understandably upset her momentarily, but I knew I had made the right choice in prioritizing her safety and consent. Story 18. I didn't get off in a tornado because the track coach refused to stop at a gas station, a decision that probably saved my life. In parts of Kansas, towns are generally spaced about 10 miles apart. Imagine 4 towns in a row from west to east. Our town was the easternmost, and we were heading to a track meet in the westernmost town. Thunderstorm and lightning warnings were severe enough that the meeting was called a little early, and everyone was sent home. There was a tornado watch for a couple of counties, but in Kansas, that isn't unusual. You often get thunderstorm warnings and tornado watches simultaneously. The clouds had an eerie greenish tint, almost like the shades you see in photographs of the northern lights, which made the atmosphere feel ominous and tense. Our school was very small, so we didn't have a bus. We used a Suburban for transportation. As we drove through one of the middle towns, one of the students asked the coach to stop at a gas station so he could grab a Gatorade. Since it was such a short drive left to reach home, the coach said no, and we continued on our way, unaware of the life-altering decision we had just benefited from. A tornado struck that town shortly after we had passed through. I'm not certain about the timing. The sky was pitch black, so it's possible we wouldn't have been able to see the tornado until we were directly in its path. The tornado obliterated the town. Tornadoes are rated from EF1 to EF5, and this was an EF5, with the highest winds tracked at 205 miles per hour. Residents from neighboring towns immediately came to help in any way possible before government organizations could intervene, providing aid, food, and support to survivors. The town looked as if someone had driven over it with a massive lawnmower. Trees were sheared off at roughly the same height. Homes were reduced to rubble, and debris littered the streets. According to reports, 12 people died and 63 were injured in a town of roughly 1,000 residents. A couple of our teachers lived there. The shop teacher survived by jumping into his bathtub just as chunks of his roof started collapsing. When I joined the cleanup efforts during the first couple of days, I noticed a few of the town's children still wearing their track uniforms. Their homes had been destroyed, and they hadn't yet found replacement clothes. Story 19. This happened just last year. I was walking into a gas station at around 7 in the morning after finishing a long shift at work. I had been dealing with persistent back pain for nearly a week, which I later found out was caused by a herniated disc. As I stepped out of my truck, a man approached me along with an older gentleman who was also heading toward the door. In my discomfort and distraction, I assumed he was asking for money, and I barely registered what he said. I simply replied, "Not now, man," and continued walking inside, focused on managing my pain and getting my morning routine done. Once inside the store, I immediately noticed that the atmosphere was tense. Everyone seemed frantic, talking rapidly on their phones and glancing in my direction. The clerk rushed over and asked if I was okay, and I assured her that I was fine. I went to grab my drink from the freezer, but the odd energy in the store made me pause. It quickly became clear that something unusual and alarming had just happened, as people's eyes were fixed on me and murmurs rippled through the room. It turned out that the man I had brushed off was holding a large revolver and was attempting to rob me. Remarkably, because I was in so much pain and preoccupied, I had not registered the threat, and I had walked past him completely unaware. My complete lack of reaction seemed to confuse him, leaving him unsure how to respond to someone who appeared completely calm and unbothered. The clerk informed me that she had already called the police. When they arrived, one of the officers asked what on earth I had been thinking. I requested to see the store's security camera footage because I still had trouble believing the man had been armed. Watching the video, it became painfully obvious that the suspect had a sizable revolver in his hand as he approached me. My pain-induced distraction had rendered me oblivious to the danger, effectively neutralizing the potential threat through sheer inattention. One of the officers laughed while discussing the situation with me, pointing out that my complete disregard for him likely saved my life. They collected my information and allowed me to leave, and I drove home feeling unusually numb, still processing how surreal and dangerous the encounter had been. Later that day, I received a call informing me that they had apprehended the suspect and asking if I wanted to press personal charges. I didn't feel strongly about it, and the officer explained that the man would face attempted robbery and brandishing a weapon charges regardless of my decision. I simply said, screw it, choosing not to complicate my life further and declined to press any personal charges, letting the legal system handle the consequences. Story 20. When I was 8 or 9, my mother had an apartment where my sister and I lived with her. She had full custody of us, as she was separated from my father. During the school year, we were evicted, and my mother had to move us frequently, bouncing us between hotels, relatives' homes, and other temporary arrangements since we had no permanent place to stay. My father eventually found out as my mother had been trying to hide our situation, and he insisted that we move back in with him. Despite being separated from my mother, he welcomed us into his home, not wanting to see his children homeless or in distress. After moving back with my father a few towns over, I left many of the friends I had made in our old apartment complex behind. Some summer weekends, my mother would take my sister and me back to our old neighborhood to visit friends and reconnect with the neighbors and their children, allowing me to relive some familiar moments from my earlier childhood. One summer, after playing outside for hours between 2 rows of apartments with my old friends, my mother took my sister and me back home. A week later, we returned to the apartment complex and went to a neighbor's house to hang out. To our shock, there was police tape everywhere, and the entire area was blocked off. We went to another of my mother's friends in the same complex, and she explained everything that had happened just a few hours after we had left, an event that would haunt me for years. Apparently, my friend's parents were hosting a young woman, likely a family friend or niece in her early 20s, who had been trying to escape an abusive relationship. The man she was fleeing discovered she was there and attempted to force his way into my friend's home. When my friend's parents refused entry, he broke in and shot both of them. My friend hid with his younger sister, while another neighbor, my other friend's father, came to investigate the commotion and was also killed. The events unfolded with shocking speed, leaving a permanent void in my childhood memories. A few weeks later, after a statewide manhunt, authorities located the perpetrator, who was keeping the young woman hostage inside a house. Law enforcement ultimately intervened and shot him during the rescue operation. I never saw or heard from my friends again, and I am not certain what happened to them or their families. This all occurred long before social media or widespread internet use, leaving many details shrouded in mystery and uncertainty. Story 21. I completed 3 years of Air Force ROTC and participated in additional drill and parade training through the National Guard while in high school, serving in an honor unit that was visited annually by vice presidents. I was highly motivated and deeply committed to military service. I also played football for 9 seasons, earning 4 conference championships, 2 state championships, and 1 undefeated season. I was being informally pre-scouted for the University of North Carolina and was on track to play for the Tar Heels, assuming I did not pursue a military career instead. Then, I was struck by a car, and everything changed. The impact severely damaged the elbow of my dominant arm, leaving it shattered beyond immediate repair. I underwent 2 reconstructive surgeries, followed by 9 months of physical therapy. A steel plate, 9 screws, and 2 pins were implanted to restore basic function. With that injury came the abrupt end of both military aspirations and college football. It was a difficult reality to accept. I responded by committing fully to self-training and rehabilitation, because accepting permanent limitation was not an option for me. Over time, I regained strength, functionality, and more than 90% range of motion, an improvement from roughly 40% at the outset. Physically and mechanically, I had recovered enough to function normally, though not without lasting reminders of the injury. Over the next 2 years, I attempted to enlist in every branch of the military. I began with the Army, hoping to attend Ranger School, then the Marine Corps, followed by the Navy and Air Force. I worked with multiple recruiters, took the ASVAB 4 times, and repeatedly went through the MEPS process. Each time, the response was nearly identical. I was told I could be a valuable asset in certain roles, but my arm would not withstand basic training, and I was denied entry every time. The disappointment was profound and deeply personal. Not long after, planes struck the towers in New York City. At the time, I was living in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, specifically Alexandria, and working in information technology for a federal institution, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. I lived within sight of the Pentagon and watched it being struck from my own balcony. Later, I saw the towers collapse on television, fully understanding that the country was entering a period of war. Standing there with my Ethiopian immigrant wife, I realized that being struck years earlier by a green Volvo driven by an off-duty police officer, traveling far too fast in a school zone on the final night before Christmas break, had been one of the luckiest events of my life. We were heading into war, one that I strongly believed would be poorly justified and deeply costly. I had narrowly avoided a direct role in it, and for the first time, I felt gratitude for a moment that once seemed like nothing but loss. Story 22. At 32 years old, living in a major city, I found myself struggling to secure a new job despite persistent efforts over the past year. I'd recently participated in a three-way interview call for a technology concierge company with both the hiring manager and the CEO, who presented as highly professional and approachable. The company appeared to operate its own smart home type application, which I would have been supporting, along with general IT assistance, though the technical specifics are not central to the story. Overall, the conversation left me feeling optimistic, energized, and genuinely excited about the possibility of joining their team. The company expressed interest in inviting me for an in-person interview, which immediately increased my enthusiasm, particularly because the position offered competitive pay and was conveniently close to home. The following day, I shared the experience with a trusted coworker and close friend, someone who knew I was exploring new employment opportunities. I mentioned that the interview had gone very well, and that the company seemed eager to hire me. She paused thoughtfully and remarked, "The CEO's name and the company sound familiar. I think I've heard something about him before." She then encouraged me to research him online, and what I discovered was alarming. The CEO had been accused of drugging and taking advantage of two young teenagers after a night out. The victims were reportedly brought back to his office, and the allegations were severe enough that he had been forced to resign from a public board position he held within the city. This revelation immediately cast doubt on both his character and the ethical standards of the company. The reason my coworker recognized him was that one of our current supervisors had previously mingled with the CEO during a lavish boat outing in a coastal town. She described him as arrogant, self-absorbed, and excessively focused on himself, demonstrating little regard for others. I felt a wave of relief that I had shared details of the interview with her, as it was only through this conversation that I became aware of his troubling history. Had I not spoken up, I could have unknowingly put myself in a potentially unsafe and ethically compromising situation. Typically, I thoroughly research companies before accepting interviews, but in this case, the relevant information was not readily visible or easy to find. I cannot imagine the discomfort and professional dilemma I would have faced had I accepted the position and later discovered these allegations. The company followed up multiple times attempting to schedule a second interview. I considered explaining my reasons for declining, but ultimately chose to disengage entirely, prioritizing my safety, professional reputation, and peace of mind. In hindsight, I am profoundly grateful for the intervention that prevented me from stepping into a hazardous situation. Story 23. As a kid, I genuinely dodged several bullets, though at the time, I was far too young and careless to understand how close I came to serious harm. Looking back now, the recklessness of that period stands out far more clearly than it did then. I was at a friend's house in a rural area, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. We were using substances and making poor decisions because frigging irresponsible kids often do not recognize consequences until much later. While we were impaired, the phone rang. We answered it, and it was a man looking for his wife. She was friends with the adults in my friend's household and also friendly with the neighbors. Typical of rural communities where social circles overlap heavily. The man believed his wife was being unfaithful, which turned out to be true, as she was involved with the neighbor next door. We told him she was not there, and hung up. The phone rang again, but in our impaired state, the ringing seemed distant and almost surreal, so we let it continue endlessly. This was a landline, long before mobile phones were common, which dates the situation quite clearly. Eventually, I picked up the receiver and could hear him speaking, though it sounded muffled and disconnected, almost unreal. I laughed, placed the receiver down, and we went outside to lie under the stars, distracted and unaware of what was unfolding. A short time later, we heard a vehicle aggressively pull into the gravel parking area. It was the same angry man who noticed his other car parked there with no wife or adults in sight. We did not see what happened next because it was late and we were in the trees behind the house. However, the man entered the house, found no one, and came back outside with a firearm. He discharged it into the wooded area where we were standing. I saw flashes of light and heard sharp sounds pass nearby, but my impaired state prevented me from immediately understanding the danger. He then turned and fired into his own vehicle, the one his wife had been using. In hindsight, I narrowly avoided serious injury that night. I was not frightened at the time, largely because I was extremely immature and surrounded by constant chaos. The people I spent time with lived in a state of ongoing conflict, and incidents like this felt disturbingly normal back then. I wish this experience had been a wake-up call, but it was not. I narrowly avoided another serious incident a year later, and then yet another the year after that. The third close call finally forced reflection. I remain deeply fortunate to have survived that phase of my life. Story 24, I grew up in, and at the time was living in, a small Canadian city. One Saturday night, a few friends and I were out together, had consumed some alcohol, and had also taken a small amount of drugs. On warm summer nights like that, we often walked home from downtown as a way to wind down and stretch the evening. We were relaxed, laughing, and genuinely enjoying ourselves without much concern for anything beyond the moment. We were only a few blocks from the house we all rented together when we passed a place with 3 to 4 men sitting on the stoop, drinking and smoking. My friend Tyler, who enjoys talking to absolutely everyone, immediately greeted them enthusiastically, asking how their night was going and trying to strike up a friendly conversation. His openness was typical of him, and normally it led to harmless interactions. The men on the stoop responded politely, and my other friends began chatting with them as well. However, something about the situation made me uneasy. Their expressions seemed slightly smug. Their responses were short, and the overall tone felt dismissive beneath the surface. They gave off a strong bugger-off energy, even though they continued engaging with us. My instincts told me something was not right. Eventually, one of the men invited us inside for beers and a smoke. I immediately felt uncomfortable and had a strong sense that going inside could lead to serious trouble, possibly being robbed or worse. Instead, I tried to redirect the situation by encouraging my friends to head back to our house, telling them I would grab some weed since we were so close. I had to argue a bit with Tyler, as the men kept insisting we come inside, but I finally managed to convince everyone to leave. Once we were home, we smoked a bowl, relaxed, and it became easy to convince everyone to stay in and fall asleep. The night ended quietly, without incident, and at the time, it felt like nothing more than an ordinary decision to head home early. None of us realized how significant that choice would turn out to be. 3 days later, I was on my lunch break at work with the news playing in the background. 2 nights after our encounter, those same men had lured 3 other young men, slightly older than us, into their house. They were essayed, and 2 of the 3 were later ended due to the attack. There is no doubt in my mind that the same outcome awaited us had we gone inside that house. Story 25. I went to an interview at a large international company for a position that seemed promising and aligned well with my previous experience. From the moment I met the woman who would be my direct manager, something felt off about her. I could not quite pinpoint it, but there was a strange, unsettling vibe in her mannerisms and tone. I tried to focus on the interview itself, answering the initial questions, but the unease persisted. After a few cursory questions, she glanced at my resume and noticed the town where I lived. She said, "Oh, I was thinking about moving there. Can you tell me about it?" I offered some brief information about the town, then attempted to redirect the conversation back to the actual job and my qualifications. Despite this, she continued for a full half hour, bombarding me with questions about my town, instead of discussing the position or responsibilities. It was increasingly clear that this interview was not proceeding normally. Recognizing the situation as futile, I politely brought the interview to a close, thanked her for her time, and left, knowing that I had no intention of accepting any potential offer. A few days later, she called me unexpectedly and extended a job offer with a competitive starting salary. I thanked her for the offer, but firmly declined. At that moment, she began yelling at me over the phone, frustrated that she would have to restart her search from scratch. I calmly hung up, realizing that I had avoided engaging with someone clearly unpredictable and difficult. A few months later, I attended a party and struck up a conversation with someone there. We discussed professional experiences, and I mentioned that I had interviewed with that company a few months prior but chose not to accept the offer. She asked, "Oh, who did you interview with?" When I said, "Mary Smith," I could immediately see recognition in her expression. She explained that Mary was notoriously difficult and rarely retained staff for more than 6 months. She confirmed that my instincts had been completely correct, and I realized I had 100% dodged a serious professional and personal bullet by trusting my gut. Story 26. In my years of professional experience, I have occasionally encountered situations that immediately set off a strong internal alarm. One incident in particular stands out as a vivid example of instinct guiding my safety. I am still waiting for the full consequences of this situation to play out. In fact, I recently looked up the individual involved to see whether there had been any legal developments, but there was nothing publicly available yet, leaving a lingering sense of unresolved tension. Several years ago, I visited the warehouse at my workplace to address an issue from the previous day. The environment was bustling, with shipments arriving, a delivery van being loaded, and employees constantly moving throughout the space. The person I needed to speak with was engaged in a casual discussion about football, so I waited nearby, reviewing my paperwork carefully and deliberately staying out of the way. Suddenly, I felt an intense, electrifying sensation from the base of my spine to the top of my head, with my scalp tingling sharply, signaling that something was very wrong. My instincts immediately signaled the presence of a potential threat behind me. I chose to turn slowly so as not to draw attention to myself, letting my eyes scan the area casually while rotating 180 degrees. As I completed the turn, I noticed 2 men conversing a few feet away. I sensed instantly that the smaller man was the source of danger, and I also realized he was very aware of my subtle observation. His neutral expression appeared forced and unnatural, amplifying the sense of unease that settled over me. Although the man eventually left the warehouse, I remained vigilant the entire time he was present, never turning my back. As soon as I could, I asked the individual I originally came to speak with who the man was. Upon learning his identity, I commented on how unsettling he seemed. Humor immediately left my colleague's face, and he confirmed that he had always found the man equally disturbing. Further conversations with female colleagues who had interacted with him produced the same reaction, a unanimous sense of discomfort and caution. The man ultimately resigned after a conflict over shared office resources and sent a strongly worded mass email to staff before departing. Story 27. Looking back with greater emotional distance, I can now recognize that my relationship with my former partner was deeply unhealthy, despite the genuine affection that existed between us. When we were together, it was frequent arguments, persistent verbal criticism, constant nitpicking, and unsolicited harsh remarks that occurred regularly. A long-term commitment with her would have closely mirrored my parents' marriage, only with greater emotional strain and instability layered on top of an already difficult dynamic. I loved her deeply. She was strikingly attractive and possessed many genuinely endearing qualities that initially drew me in and kept me hopeful. Unfortunately, her temper was consistently volatile and unpredictable, turning everyday interactions into emotional minefields. Being with her often felt like living within a recurring emotional nightmare. We remained together for 3 years in a long-distance relationship, but things ultimately unraveled a few months after I chose to take a spring vacation to Miami instead of visiting her. At that point, I still wanted the relationship to continue, but only if her anger and mean-spirited behavior meaningfully improved. She cited my trip as her reason for ending things. I spent a great deal of time praying earnestly for her heart to soften, but that change never came. She eventually married the man she left me for. I remain unmarried, although I have dated extensively since then and have experienced several meaningful relationships. None of those women treated me with anywhere near the level of emotional cruelty I experienced with this former partner. In fact, some treated me exceptionally well. Not because I altered myself or sought approval, but simply because they recognized and appreciated who I was. They valued me for my character, my sincerity, and my capacity for care. What remains both ironic and deeply painful is that I have never been able to love anyone else in quite the same way. Despite the way she treated me and others, and even though we have been apart for 11 years, I still think of her often. At least once a week, I find myself wondering, what if? I revisit countless alternate possibilities, questioning what I could have done differently for us to end up together. What if I did not have autism? What if I had established firmer boundaries earlier? What if I had presented myself as more distant, confident, or emotionally guarded? What if I had not made myself so readily available? I believe part of this lingering attachment is tied to intimacy, as she was the first woman who I've been intimate with. Carrying these thoughts has left me with a deep sense of self-directed frustration and sorrow that I continue to work through. Story 28. I worked as overnight mall security on weekends for approximately 5 years while attending college. It was generally a calm and uneventful job. The most notable incident during one shift was when the bathroom pipes burst due to cold weather. I ultimately decided to resign a year after graduating. About 2 months after quitting, I ran into my former boss at a store. He looked incredibly stressed. He explained that 2 weeks after I left, a group of thieves had broken into a jewelry store during my old shift. Since more than a decade has passed, it seems appropriate to share these details. The new security guard who replaced me had neglected to check whether the doors were locked that night, leaving one door unsecured and allowing the thieves to enter the mall without difficulty. My former boss insisted that if I had been on duty, the break-in likely would not have occurred. However, based on the details he provided, I remain unconvinced. The thieves had entered through a service entrance I routinely discovered unlocked during my initial patrols, which was also the door I typically checked last. They were first spotted on security cameras around the time I would have reached that door. Had I been working, I might have locked it just seconds before they arrived or encountered them as they entered, armed with guns and wire cutters. Needless to say, I was moderately unsettled for the remainder of the week after hearing the story. I could not help but speculate whether the thieves were aware of my patrol habits, especially since a former guard who knew my routines had been fired a few weeks before I left, or if they had simply observed that the particular door was frequently left unlocked during weekday nights. Story 29. In 1985, Texas, my mother arranged for me to spend a day visiting a different school to see if it might be a suitable option for me to transfer to for 7th grade. I remember feeling a mix of nervousness and curiosity, uncertain what to expect, and quietly questioning whether this new environment could offer something better than my current school experience, despite the many unknowns that lay ahead. During my visit, the science teacher invited me to interact with a massive vat of mercury he kept in the classroom. He encouraged me to immerse my entire arm in the mercury, past the elbow, to observe how the liquid just beaded off my skin without leaving any visible residue. "Isn't that fascinating?" he said enthusiastically. He even promised additional time to experiment with the mercury on a future class day, which I naively thought would be both exciting and harmless. At the time, I had no understanding of how dangerously toxic mercury could be. Beyond that, the school itself gave off extremely unsettling vibes. The principal held very old-fashioned and rigid views about gender roles. For example, he required all the boys to stand whenever a girl entered the classroom and would even pull out our chairs for us when we sat down. This was middle school, and his lectures about preparing future husbands and wives felt pushy, awkward, and deeply uncomfortable, heightening my unease throughout the day. It felt even more inappropriate when the school assigned me a locker and handed me textbooks, even though I was only a visitor and not officially enrolled. At the end of the day, I returned the textbooks to the nearest teacher and walked out of the school immediately. I vividly remember one of the stunned boys asking, "Wait, you're leaving? You can just do that?" I calmly replied, "Yes, I'm telling my parents I don't want to attend this school." His eyes widened in disbelief. "And they'll just let you do that?" "Yes," I said firmly, feeling a surprising sense of autonomy and control over my own choices for the first time in such a restrictive setting. Reflecting on that day years later, that boy's shock at my independence, combined with the terrifying vat of mercury, makes me feel like I dodged a massive bullet. I genuinely did not want to become part of a repressive environment or risk mercury poisoning at such a young age. Leaving that school preserved not only my physical safety, but also my sense of agency and personal judgment. I was raised by fundamentalist evangelicals and had grown accustomed to conservative rules at home. This school, however, was aggressively controlling and domineering toward girls, far beyond what I had ever experienced, making my decision to leave feel even more crucial and life-defining in hindsight. Story 30. I dated a man for almost 5 years, and during that time, he briefly but intensely lost control in a moment of rage. I immediately said no way, left mid-vacation, and returned home to change my locks. It later became clear that this was part of a pattern in his life. Whenever he became serious with a new partner, he would deliberately become violent with the person he was dating to make them leave quickly. This allowed him to avoid messy breakups or any attempts at reconciliation. His exes generally went out of their way to avoid him, fearing that he might explode on them. Because life is strange, I am now friends with 2 other ex-partners, and we have compared notes. It turns out he leads a highly scripted life. The love letters he writes are all the same. The birthday gifts are identical. And each of the three of us owns the same custom-made t-shirt. It is remarkable and unsettling how predictable his methods are once you piece the patterns together. I did not expect my comment to gain so much attention. I will do my best to answer questions in the comments over the next day or so. I will refrain from providing overly specific details, as we all live in the same city. While it is not a small town, there are only 2 or 3 degrees of separation within the local gay community. Those who are unfamiliar could potentially piece together who I am and who I am referring to from publicly available information. The individual in question has left me alone despite our paths crossing a few times, and I intend to maintain that distance. I also want to respect the privacy of the 2 other exes who did not choose to post on Reddit. I will also add that while it is satisfying that my comment resonated with so many people, I am simultaneously saddened by how many individuals have had similar experiences. I did not anticipate this response when I impulsively wrote a few sentences to share my story. Story 31, I almost fell for a vacation club pitch, essentially a timeshare. My wife and I were in Las Vegas for her birthday, staying for free after attending a presentation. The offer was through Hilton and sounded like an incredible deal. Ironically, I had just won the money for the down payment the day before, planning to use it on tickets to see Journey later that evening. I wanted it to be a surprise, but I told my wife that if she preferred the timeshare instead, we could go that route. She chose the Journey tickets, and we had an unforgettable night. We stayed in a suite and enjoyed a lot of complimentary food and drinks, thanks to other attendees in the presentation booth who generously shared their orders. Toward the end of Journey's set, they sang Happy Birthday to lead singer Arnel Pineda, and my wife still fondly recalls that moment because she hadn't realized they shared a birthday. That night was in September 2018. 2 months later, I left my job to pursue an MBA and transition into a new career path. Then, COVID hit in 2020, shifting priorities for everyone. A surprising twist came in March 2023 when we watched a Last Week Tonight with John Oliver episode about timeshares. We were amazed to see how close we had come to being conned. Over the years, we had attended multiple presentations and had been able to easily decline, as the company's properties were generally in locations we wouldn't want to visit. But this one was Hilton, an established, reputable brand, and the deal sounded appealing. Equity, discounted travel at any time of year, and properties all over the world. Looking back, we may have even considered applying for the Hilton credit card at the time, though I can't recall for certain. Watching the John Oliver segment reinforced how fortunate we were to trust our instincts, say no, and enjoy Journey instead. It remains a memorable lesson in exercising caution and doing thorough research before making big financial decisions. Story 32. An old landlord once approached me and said, "Oh, you're good with computers. I know a guy who is looking to hire some tech people." He gave me the contact information, so I called the individual and he told me he would email further details. After receiving the email, I tried to look up the address where I was supposed to go. It didn't look like a typical office building, more like some type of rental hall. That struck me as odd, but I figured they could have purchased the property recently, or perhaps the street view image was outdated. When I arrived at the interview, I immediately noticed all the chairs arranged in a presentation style. I realized something was off, but the man was already shaking my hand, pointing out the coffee and snack table and telling me I could sit anywhere. I decided to sit through the first part of the presentation politely and enjoy a surprisingly tasty cheese Danish, all while looking for the first opportunity to leave. At the first break, I went to the restroom and quietly slipped out. It became clear that the entire setup was a classic pyramid scheme. The pitch was that you would be your own boss and sell merchandise through a website they set up for you. Being tech-savvy, I had no involvement in creating the website, but the real catch was that to earn significant money, you needed to recruit others into your downline and earn a portion of their sales. When I mentioned to my landlord that it was a pyramid scheme, he dismissed my concerns and insisted it was a legitimate opportunity, even trying to convince me otherwise. After that, I avoided discussing any of these ventures with him and moved on. Story 33. I experienced something quite similar in my career. I was working outside of the branch I had always specialized in and wanted to explore a new field. I took the opportunity and fully committed to it. About 6 weeks in, I was informed that my contract would not be renewed, even though I still had nearly 6 months remaining. Legally, it would have been very difficult for the company to terminate me early. And it was actually in their best interest to simply wait out my contract while I continued working until it ended, a very common practice here in the Netherlands. Despite this, I was pressured to start looking for work elsewhere as soon as possible. Since I am a bicycle mechanic by trade, I began searching for opportunities to return to that field. However, the bicycle branch is somewhat seasonal. There is work throughout the year, but companies typically do not hire during the winter months, which is the quieter season. My contract was ending in March, so I did not feel an urgent need to leave immediately, and the beginning of the year is an ideal time to transition back into the bicycle industry. I approached the situation strategically. The company I had been working for had hired me, knowing I lacked both extensive experience and the formal education usually required for the role. As a result, they should have provided structured guidance during my initial period, but they failed to do so. This meant I was under no rush to leave and could carefully plan my next move. Eventually, I secured a position that would start in February, a month before my contract officially ended. I took my paid leave and spent my days at home playing games, relaxing, and waiting for the new role to begin. Then, while sitting on the couch, I received an email that completely shifted the situation. The company I had just left had filed for bankruptcy. Story 34. I worked as a bank teller many years ago. It was my first week at the largest branch in my city, both in terms of cash volume and customer traffic. The branch was so busy that it even had a drive-through for business deposits, equipped with bulletproof glass to handle the sheer number of customers it served daily. During my shift, I was assisting a newly retired couple who were obtaining travelers' checks for their planned world tour. They were so excited that they chatted non-stop while completing their portion of the process. On a typical day, the transaction would take about 10 minutes, but with their enthusiasm, it was drawn out considerably. Because they were conducting this advanced type of transaction, they were in the branch's advanced services area, an area where tellers could provide more services, including larger cash amounts, without requiring additional support. Behind them, a man was growing increasingly impatient with their cheerfulness and the time the transaction was taking. He suddenly yelled at me, "Hurry it up!" I responded firmly, letting him know that if he wanted immediate service, he could proceed to the other area. I pointed to a colleague who was equally capable of handling his transaction and said, "She can assist you." What we later discovered was that the man was an addict, desperate for a fix, and had come prepared to rob the bank. He eventually flashed a gun at my colleague, who managed the situation as best she could in that moment. The experience took an enormous toll on her, and she eventually resigned a few months later, likely due to the stress and trauma she endured. I am so very sorry, Ashley. Remarkably, the retired couple had no idea that a robbery was occurring the entire time. They only became aware after having to complete witness reports and remain at the bank for an additional hour and a half. Story 35. I have had 2 close calls in my life that stand out vividly. The first occurred when I was in medical school in Richmond, Virginia, and it was one of the rare times that laziness actually saved me. Our classes typically ran all morning, and I would usually spend 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon studying on campus. I knew a Hurricane Gaston was approaching that day, but instead of studying, I decided to skip my usual routine and have a hurricane party with friends. I drove home from the parking lot, which was located at the lowest part of the city, right by the river. Friends came over, we partied, the power went out, and shortly afterward, the entire lower part of the city flooded. Half of my classmates lost their cars that were parked in the lower lots. My roommate had to walk 2 miles home through sewage-contaminated floodwaters. Many people had to be rescued by boat and helicopter later that day. The second close call happened in Colorado, where I now live. While driving home from work on Interstate 70, I hit a massive traffic jam. Google Maps indicated there was a serious wreck several miles ahead. On impulse, I took an exit 2 exits before my usual one, a route I had never taken before. Normally, I would have just stayed in traffic and powered through. Moments after I exited, a semi-truck with failed brakes slammed into the traffic jam just a few hundred yards up the road from where I had exited. Numerous people were killed or severely burned in the collision. I did not witness the wreck myself, but my wife called to make sure I was safe. And it was then that I realized how narrowly I had avoided disaster. Notably, a friend of mine was 1 car ahead of the impact and became the first healthcare provider on the scene, assisting the injured. Story 36. This incident occurred at the job where I had worked the longest, and it truly broke my heart because the situation was handled in an extremely careless and unprofessional way. Business sharply declined after we hired a frigging 19-year-old who decided to rob a regular customer. This customer, who did not trust banks, often carried anywhere from high $50,000 to low $100,000 in cash in a bag with them, creating a dangerous and entirely avoidable situation. Her boyfriend ambushed him in the parking lot, got $60,000, and she irresponsibly bought a frigging French bulldog with it, spent it on frivolous things, and posted about it. He was arrested, and once word spread that this had happened at our workplace, customers stopped coming, devastating the business. Shortly after, a man arrived roughly 30 minutes before opening and went on a random rampage with a bat. He moved through the parking lot, smashing windshields and knocking off mirrors like a scene straight out of Carrie Underwood's Before He Cheats music video. He messed up a significant number of cars, leaving everyone in shock. The most remarkable part is that the new general manager, who was notoriously awful to everyone, had fired some employees without any communication and even threatened them to avoid accountability. He posted a video from the security cameras showing his brand new $100,000 truck being smashed during the incident. The footage was leaked to a local crime reporting page, allowing everyone he had fired to watch his truck get destroyed. This public spectacle further damaged the business, driving away even more customers. If he hadn't fired me as well, my vehicle would have been in that parking lot, and likely messed up during the rampage too, which makes me feel incredibly fortunate. The entire series of events highlighted not only reckless employees, but also poor management decisions, putting both people and business stability at serious risk. Story 37. I had been living with an extremely toxic roommate, someone who could not see the bigger picture from inside their own perspective. I genuinely wanted to help them, so when the opportunity arose for me to move to a different state, I invited them to come along. They had struggled before, and I thought I could be a supportive best friend. I never anticipated how much their toxicity would intensify. From the moment the idea was proposed, they started making endless bargaining arguments trying to delay any commitment. Their behavior became increasingly offhand, unreasonable, and unpredictable, even though it was clear they had no actual intention of leaving the state. Since they could not drive, I essentially became their caretaker, managing not only my life, but theirs as well. On the literal day of the move, I reached a breaking point. I told them I refused to bring them with me because they could not make a decision, had not packed most of their belongings, and refused to assist me with the shared responsibilities we had agreed upon. They insisted I'm only touching my things, even though we had shared many common items, including dishes, furniture, and toiletries. The situation was unsustainable. Thankfully, their adopted family stepped in to pick them up, preventing them from becoming homeless. That moment was a revelation for me. I realized how badly my life could have been held back by continuing to accommodate their indecision and toxic behavior. After finally having a space of my own, the difference was immediately noticeable. I could breathe and regain autonomy over my time, energy, and decisions. The roommate refused to pay their final half of the utilities and half of the money they had promised for the move. They had maintained this bizarre principle that they stick to their word, yet used it as a weapon to justify not fulfilling their obligations. I was understandably frustrated, hurt, and disheartened by their manipulations and lack of accountability. This experience made me understand how much my personal growth and future could have been constrained if I had allowed them to come along. Looking back, the real significance of this decision became clear over time. By removing this toxic influence from my life, I gained the freedom and flexibility to make meaningful life choices, including meeting my now husband. Had the roommate come with me, I doubt I would have had the space, emotional bandwidth, or independence to fully explore new relationships or opportunities. The move became a turning point, a pivotal moment in which avoiding that negative situation set the stage for all the positive changes that followed. I am incredibly grateful for that difficult but necessary decision. At the time, it may have seemed like a simple refusal to accommodate someone else, but in reality, it was a major bullet dodged. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.